The Red Dead series has taken us on an unforgettable journey through the harsh and unforgiving world of the American frontier, introducing us to some of the most iconic gunslingers and outlaws in gaming history, each with a story of loyalty, survival, and redemption. But before the saloons, the shootouts, and the high-stake robberies, every character had a story and a life that shaped who they would become. From John Marston's years as a young gang member under Dutch van der Linde to Arthur Morgan's rise as Dutch's most trusted enforcer, and even further back to Red Harlow's quest for vengeance after the loss of his family. These are the origin stories of the legends that we ride alongside in Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Revolver. We'll be starting with Red Dead Revolver, a game that many casual Red Dead fans tend to overlook. Interestingly, Red Harlow isn't the only playable character in the game. While Red is the central protagonist, players also briefly step into the boots of a few other characters during specific missions. In total, the game offers control of 4 other characters, making it a very unique entry in the series. Other than Red Harlow, Red Dead Revolver lets you play as Jack Swift, Annie Stoakes, Shadow Wolf, and Buffalo Soldier. And while these characters are technically protagonists, the game's narrative primarily revolves around Red Harlow as the central figure. So we will be including them in today's video, but their parts will be much more summarized in comparison to the other main protagonists. We'll be starting with Jack Swift, also known as the Londoner. Born in Sandhurst, England, he was raised as a gentleman and played rugby in his youth. He fled to America after a scandal involving a royal family member, likely escaping execution. In the US, he became a renowned sharpshooter and was invited by ringmaster Preston O'Leary to perform in his circus. However, after O'Leary's death in a suspicious fire, control passed to Professor Perry, with whom Jack had a contentious relationship. Their feud led to Perry imprisoning Jack in a cage at the fairgrounds. Annie Stoakes is a skilled cattle rancher who lives near Bear Mountain, and she's well known for wielding a repeating rifle named Faith. Raised by her father to defy traditional gender roles, she thrived as an independent rancher in a male-dominated, violent society. Her life took a turn when Governor Griffin became determined to take her ranch, resorting to bribery and intimidation after she refused to sell. Despite his efforts to scare off her ranch hands, Annie's resilience only strengthened, driving her to work even harder to protect what was hers. Shadow Wolf was a Native American scout and warrior who preferred hunting and scouting alone. When Chief Running Moon banned him from visiting his favorite cousin Red Harlow, he became even more distant. Despite this, the tribe respected him for his exceptional woodcraft and his refusal to back down from insults, especially those from the rival Black Elk tribe. Buffalo Soldier is a US Army soldier and former slave. During a small incursion into a territory associated with General Diego's shady business dealings, he and his troop were ambushed by Diego's rebels, and his entire troop was wiped out, and he was captured by Diego, and as a result, he was forced to work in the Bear Mountain mine. Next up, we have Red Harlow. This tale begins at the Indian territory known as Bear Mountain, years before the events of Red Dead Revolver. Here, we meet the Wolf tribe, a Native American family living near the Bear Mountain, who are locked in a bitter blood feud with the Black Elk tribe, another family also living in the mountain. This rivalry only worsened after the Black Elks allied with General Javier Diego and desecrated the Red Wolf's sacred burial grounds. The Red Wolf tribe is headed by Chief Running Moon. His daughter, Falling Star, fell in love with a prospector named Nate Harlow, but their relationship was disapproved by the tribe. Falling Star left with Nate, and the couple built a small homestead in the plains at a place called Broken Creek, far from Bear Mountain, to avoid her father's interference. Red Harlow, their only son, was born in the early 1860s and was raised at their secluded home. From a young age, Red was taught to hunt by his parents, as both of them were skilled hunters and felt it was necessary to teach their son how to survive like them. In the 1870s, Nate Harlow and his partner Griffin discovered gold in Bear Mountain. To celebrate, they traveled to the nearest town and commissioned a pair of custom-made pistols, nicknamed the Scorpion Revolvers, in honor of the chief's spirit animal. Before parting ways, Nate ensured his half of the gold vein was legally registered in his name. Unfortunately, Griffin was later caught while attempting to cross the Rio Grande, where General Javier Diego was battling the US Army. Facing execution, Griffin struck a deal offering Diego half the gold and proposing a partnership, suggesting Nate could be eliminated to secure the other half of the claim. After returning home from prospecting, Nate showed the Scorpion Revolver to his son, Red, promising it would one day be his. He then gave Red his old pistol as a present. However, their peace was short-lived as bandits paid by Colonel Darren attacked their home. Nate and Red fought courageously, killing most of the attackers, but Darren and 2 others managed to overpower them. In the end, Nate and Falling Star were murdered, while Red miraculously managed to escape by severely wounding Darren in the arm using Nate's scorched Scorpion pistol. 12 years later, in the late 1880s, Red is now in his 20s, bore a scar on his hand, and roamed the plains with his dog. Fueled by raging hatred for criminals, Red became a fortune hunter, roaming primarily on foot but never straying too far from home. While passing through Twin Rocks one day, he encountered a merchant named Curly Shaw, but their meeting was interrupted by the Bloody Tom gang. Red dispatched the gang's minor members, provoking Bloody Tom and his lieutenants into a fight. In a fierce battle, Red killed all three, cementing his reputation as a formidable gunslinger. John Marston was born in the northern United States in 1873. His father was a Scottish immigrant who was born on the boat to New York, so he never got to see his father's homeland, and his mother was a prostitute who died during John's birth. John lived with his father up until he was 8 years old, and that's when his father died in a bar fight. With no one to take care of John, he was sent to an orphanage where he would spend the next few years. Eventually, John ran away from the orphanage and ended up living on the streets. By the time he was 11 years old, he shot and killed a man, but he claimed that that was not his fault. A year later, in 1885, John had been caught stealing by homesteaders in Illinois, and they planned on hanging him. That's when Dutch Vanderlyn stepped in and saved John from death by taking him under his wing and introducing him into the Vanderlyn gang, alongside Hosea Matthews, Arthur Morgan, and Susan Grimshaw. The gang quickly turned into John's new family, with Dutch becoming his mentor and father figure. Growing up as a member of the Vanderlyn gang gave John the skills to become an experienced outlaw. The gang would take part in a series of robberies, raids, murders, kidnappings, and other crimes across the American frontier. According to many members of the gang, including Arthur Morgan, John quickly became Dutch's golden boy. John was deeply influenced by Dutch's philosophy, convinced that the gang's actions had a purpose. They stole from the wealthy and gave it to the poor, aiming to inspire the people of the West. However, he later came to realize that these ideals were merely justifications for their indiscriminate robbing and stealing. In 1894, a prostitute named Abigail Roberts joined the Vanderlyn gang, and despite being shared around the camp like stories by the fire, she eventually fell in love with John. The two would later go on to have a child in 1895 named Jack. Being born into the gang, Jack grew up knowing the gang members as his extended family, referring to the other gang members as his aunts and uncles. In his early years, John struggled to connect with Jack, as it was hard for him to accept that Jack could be his biological son. On top of this, John doubted his own abilities to raise a child, which is likely due to his own upbringing. Unable to take responsibility, John decided it was best to leave the gang and his family behind. His time away from the gang only lasted a year before making his return. Dutch and Hosea were happy to see John back, but Arthur felt betrayed by John's actions, and the pair would quickly grow further and further apart over the next few years. The Vanderlyn gang continued to grow over the years, introducing Micah Bell, Lenny Summers, and Charles Smith. The gang traveled east until they reached a town of Blackwater, where they would settle down on the outskirts. Soon after, Micah would present Dutch with a plan to rob a boat. John, alongside other members of the gang, would take part in the heist, but the plan quickly fell apart when Dutch shot a young woman in the head, and the gang became swarmed by the Pinkertons. This resulted in a massive shootout as the gang fled, leaving them no option but to stash the money and come back for it when the heat dies down. During the shootout, several members of the gang got shot, including John. However, he was the only one lucky enough to survive being shot. The gang headed up north, where they got caught up in a snowstorm on the mountains of Amberino. John and Micah were sent to scout out locations for the gang to seek shelter and gather supplies. Unfortunately for John, he was unable to make his way back to the gang. This was until Abigail begged Arthur to go out and find him, as he had been missing for 2 days. Reluctant to help, Hosea steps in and sends Arthur and Javier on their way to find John. Arthur Morgan was born in the northern United States around 1863 to Beatrice and Lyle Morgan. Unfortunately, Arthur's mother had passed away when he was just a young boy, leaving it up to his father to raise him. It's implied that he had an abusive or strained relationship with his father. He was also an outlaw that was involved in petty crime. By the time Arthur was 11 years old, his father was arrested for larceny. Sometime after that, Arthur witnessed his death. Despite their troubled relationship, he would still keep a picture of him, and he would also wear his father's hat. Around 1877, Dutch Vanderlyn and Hosea Matthews found Arthur and took him off the streets. Arthur looked up to the pair as fatherly figures, something Arthur was missing out on. He began to embrace that way of life and supported Dutch's dreams and ideologies of living a life free from rules and regulations. Dutch and Hosea taught Arthur everything he knows, making him their very first protege, as well as one of the founding members of the Vanderlyn gang. Later on, Susan Grimshaw joined the gang, and she got engaged to Dutch. This provided Arthur with someone who acted as a tough, motherly figure. As a young adult, Arthur met a girl named Mary Gillis, and the pair soon fell in love, eventually eventually becoming engaged. He even taught Mary's younger brother Jamie how to ride horses. Unfortunately though, they lived two very different lives which began to drift further and further apart. Arthur was not ready to give up his life of crime, and because of this, Mary's family disapproved of their relationship. In 1885, when Arthur was around the age of 22, he was introduced to a 12-year-old boy named John Marston after being saved by Dutch, and the two kids would quickly grow close as brothers. They would also go on to become Dutch's favourite sons. Then in 1887, Arthur, Dutch and Hosea would take on their first major robbery, taking off with $5,000 in gold, only to hand it out to the poor, claiming themselves to be like Robin Hood figures. This robbery made Arthur Morgan become a wanted man. A few years after this, Arthur got intimate with a waitress named Eliza, and she soon fell pregnant with their son Isaac. Eliza wasn't like Mary, she knew what Arthur's lifestyle was like, and instead of trying to convince him to change, she accepted him and the life he was involved in. Arthur offered support when and where he could, but he didn't want to promise her anything he couldn't keep, but instead he said that he would do right by them. Arthur would occasionally visit Eliza and Isaac every few months and stay with them for days at a time, developing a good relationship with his son. This would go on for some time until one day Arthur arrived at their home and he saw two crosses outside. He knew immediately that they were both dead. He later discovered that they had been shot and killed by robbers, all for $10. This incident hardened Arthur, and as a result, he never truly coped with the pain, but understood that you don't get to live a bad life and have good things happen to you. As mentioned earlier in John's backstory, John had left the gang for a period of time as he was unable to accept the responsibilities that came with being a father. Upon his return, this caused a rift in Arthur and John's relationship. The pair were like brothers, but due to John's actions, it left Arthur feeling betrayed. By 1899, the gang had arrived in West Elizabeth and decided to set up camp along the outskirts of Blackwater, and the gang went out to scope potential money-making opportunities. One of these included the planned boat heist that we mentioned earlier in John's backstory, but while that was going on, Arthur and Hosea were planning a hefty real estate scam and would link up with the gang the following day. Of course, we all know that the heist didn't go to plan. Multiple members were shot and killed, and those that were lucky enough to escape fled up north into the mountains where they would regroup, and the story of Red Dead Redemption 2 would begin here. Now you might be wondering why I skipped Jack Marston. The idea of the video is to share with you the origins or the backstories of each protagonist before the games, and while Jack is indeed one of those protagonists, his life is already shown throughout the events of Red Dead 1 and 2. So if I were to discuss what Jack Marston was doing before the events of Red Dead, then I guess we'd have to take a closer look inside of John Marston's test. If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.